The first rays of dawn stretched lazily across the sleepy town of Goddard, painting its quaint streets in a warm golden hue. Goddard was like any other small town, with its mom-and-pop stores, local diner that everyone frequented, and neighbors who knew each other by name. Josh, was one of its unremarkable residents, a man who lived a life so ordinary it bordered on monotonous. I worked at a local bookstore, a job that suited my introverted nature, and lived in a modest apartment on Maple Street. But beneath the veneer of this idyllic setting, Goddard harbored a dark secret, one that had the town gripped in a silent fear. A series of brutal murders had shaken our community over the past few months. Each was more gruesome than the last, leaving the police baffled and the residents terrified. I followed the news like everyone else, feeling a mix of horror and fascination, but never imagined how close to home these events would hit. My life was mundane, structured, and predictable until the blackouts started. They began subtly, mere blips in my daily routine. I'd find myself standing in a room with no recollection of walking there or staring at a half-eaten meal, unsure when I had started eating. Initially, I attributed these lapses to stress or lack of sleep. However, as they grew more frequent and prolonged, a gnawing sense of dread began to take root in my mind. One particular morning stands out in my memory, a turning point that marked the beginning of my descent into a terrifying unknown. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding against my ribcage, and a cold sweat drenching my sheets. The room was dark, save for the sliver of light sneaking in through the curtains. Disoriented, I reached for the lamp on my nightstand and flicked it on. The light revealed a sight that sent chills down my spine, a bloody knife lying on my bedroom floor. Panic surged through me. My mind raced with questions, but no answers came. I had no memory of the previous night, no recollection of how that knife got there, or why it was stained with blood. The rational part of me screamed to call the police, to report this, but another voice, one laced with fear, urged me to hide it. After a moment of internal struggle, I wrapped the knife in an old t-shirt and tucked it away in a box at the back of my closet. I told myself it was to protect myself until I could make sense of things, but deep down, I knew I was afraid of what the truth might be. The day unfolded in a blur. I went through the motions at work, my mind a million miles away. The friendly chatter of customers and the smell of old books, usually so comforting, now seemed distant and foreign. All I could think about was the bloody knife and the black void in my memory. Later that afternoon, the town's uneasy calm was shattered by the news of another murder. A chill ran down my spine as I listened to the report. The victim was found not far from where I lived, and the details were eerily similar to what I had discovered in my apartment. A wave of nausea hit me, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. There was a connection between me and these murders, a link I couldn't ignore. The blackouts, the knife, the proximity of the crime, it was too much to be a coincidence. A haunting thought crept into my mind, unbidden and terrifying. Was I involved in these murders? Sleep eluded me that night, and in the dark, quiet hours before dawn, I made a decision. I would investigate these murders myself. I needed to understand what was happening during my blackouts, to clear my name, or confirm my worst fears. Little did I know, this decision would lead me down a path from which there would be no return. The following days were a haze of concealed panic and feigned normalcy. Goddard, once a sanctuary of small-town charm, now felt like a maze of unseen threats. I walked its streets with a sense of alienation, eyeing each familiar face with a mixture of suspicion and fear. Was I capable of such brutality? The very thought sent shivers down my spine. I started my investigation with a simple yet daunting task: retracing my steps. Each night, before the blackouts, I kept a detailed journal of my activities, hoping to find a pattern or trigger. The entries were mundane, almost painfully ordinary, a reflection of the life I thought I knew. But between the lines of routine, I began to notice odd inconsistencies. Unaccounted hours, vague references to places I didn't remember visiting, and cryptic notes I didn't recall writing. My next step was to delve deeper into the details of the murders. I scoured news reports, pieced together police statements, and even eavesdropped on local gossip at the diner. The victims were seemingly random, with no apparent connection to each other. But to me, they started to represent fragmented mirrors of my lost time, each holding a piece of the puzzle I was desperate to solve. One evening, my search led me to a chilling realization. A witness mentioned seeing a figure lurking near one of the crime scenes, a figure that matched my build and height. My heart sank. The walls of my own home felt like they were closing in on me. That night, I barely slept, tormented by the image of myself as a predator in the shadows. The strain of living a double life, one foot in normalcy, the other in a nightmarish possibility, began to take its toll. I found myself jumping at shadows, my own reflection in the mirror becoming a source of suspicion. My interactions with friends and colleagues grew strained. How could I converse about mundane matters when I harbored such a dark secret? Then came the close call that shattered my fragile facade. I was following up on a lead near the latest crime scene when I noticed a police car trailing me. Panic gripped me, my mind racing with the possibility of being caught. In a moment of desperation, I ducked into an alley and narrowly avoided detection. That experience left me shaken. It was a stark reminder of the gravity of my situation. Amidst this chaos, a haunting suspicion began to grow stronger day by day. The blackouts, the evidence, the proximity to the crimes had all pointed towards a horrifying conclusion. I was no longer just searching for a killer, I was searching for myself. The realization that I might be the very monster I was hunting was a bitter pill to swallow. It was a duality that tore at the very fabric of my identity. As the days passed, my life became a macabre dance between seeking the truth and fearing it. Each step forward in my investigation was a step deeper into an abyss of my own making. The truth was close, I could feel it, but so was the unraveling of the world as I knew it. The shadow of doubt had become my constant companion, a reminder of the unseen predator lurking within. The investigation became my obsession, consuming every waking hour. Each clue I uncovered only served to deepen the mystery and my connection to it. The more I delved into the murders, the more I felt a disturbing sense of familiarity with the details, as if part of me recognized a pattern of brutality that I couldn't consciously recall. My blackouts grew more frequent and prolonged, creating gaping holes in my memory. I would find myself in places with no recollection of how I got there, or holding items that I didn't remember acquiring. The terror of not knowing what I might have done during those lost hours was overwhelming. The fear of discovering the truth battled with the fear of remaining ignorant, each equally paralyzing. I decided to install cameras in my apartment, desperate for any insight into what happened during my blackouts. The first few nights revealed nothing unusual, but then came the night that changed everything. I woke up with the familiar fog of confusion, a sense that something terrible had occurred. Rushing to review the camera footage, my blood ran cold at what I saw. The footage showed me awakening in the middle of the night, moving with a purposeful and eerie calmness that I didn't recognize. My expression was vacant, my movements methodical and alien. I watched myself prepare a bag with an assortment of items: rope, gloves, and chillingly, a knife. The person on the screen was me, but it wasn't the me I knew. It was someone or something else entirely. This revelation shattered the remnants of my denial. I was living with a stranger inside me, a stranger capable of horrific acts. The thought that I could be responsible for the terror that had gripped Goddard was unbearable. I felt like a puppet in the hands of a malevolent force that I couldn't control or understand. In a desperate bid for answers, I started researching cases of split personalities, amnesiac episodes, and anything that could explain my situation. I stumbled upon articles about traumatic events triggering alternate personas, and for the first time, fragments of my own past began to resurface, flashes of a childhood marred by shadows I had long suppressed. But these snippets of memory brought more questions than answers. My encounters with the townsfolk became increasingly fraught with paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that they suspected me, or worse, knew my secret. The once friendly smiles of my neighbors now seemed to hide a silent accusation. I became a recluse, avoiding social interaction as much as possible, fearing that I might unwittingly reveal my dreadful secret or, even worse, harm someone during a blackout. The murders continued, each new crime seemed a grotesque masterpiece that echoed the turmoil in my psyche. The police were closing in, their investigation narrowing its focus. I knew it was only a matter of time before they connected the dots leading to me. Yet, part of me yearned for that end, an end to the uncertainty, the fear, and the guilt that gnawed at my soul. As the line between my waking life and a hidden nocturnal existence blurred, I struggled to maintain a grip on my sanity. The descent into darkness was swift and unforgiving. I was caught in a web of my own making, a prisoner of a mind that harbored an unseen predator. The terror lay not just in the acts that this other self committed, but in the growing realization that this darkness had always been a part of me, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to emerge. The nights became an endless cycle of fear and anticipation. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a sense of dread settled over me. I was no longer sure who I would be when morning came. The person in the mirror looked back at me with a familiarity that now seemed like a facade, hiding the monster that lurked beneath. My investigations, once a beacon of hope for understanding, now felt like a torturous journey towards an inevitable truth I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. But I couldn't stop, driven by a morbid fascination and a desperate need for closure. Then, the night came that broke the fragile barrier between my two worlds. I experienced a blackout, but this time, I awoke in the midst of an act so horrifying that it seared itself into my consciousness. I was standing in a dark room, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. In my hand was a knife. The shock of this realization snapped something inside me. For the first time, I was fully conscious within this other persona, a spectator to the horror it was capable of. My hands shook as I looked at the scene before me, the walls of the room closing in. I stumbled backwards, dropping the knife as a wave of nausea and dread overwhelmed me. The reality of what I had become, what I had done, crashed down on me with merciless clarity. In that moment, the fragments of my past began to weave together, forming a picture that was as clear as it was terrifying. Memories long buried surged to the surface, traumatic glimpses of a childhood marked by violence and fear. I remembered a time when I had created an imaginary friend to escape the horrors of my reality. Only now, I realized that this friend had never truly left. It had lurked in the depths of my psyche, a dormant entity waiting for a trigger to awaken it. As I stood there, the weight of my actions bearing down on me, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. A part of me wanted to surrender, to end this nightmare and face the consequences of my actions. But the survival instinct of this other self was stronger, and before I could make a conscious decision, I found myself fleeing the scene, driven by a primal urge to survive. The following days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I was a fugitive, hunted by the law and haunted by my own conscience. I avoided capture through a combination of luck and the cunning of my alter ego. But with each passing day, the line between Josh and this other self grew more blurred. I could no longer tell where I ended and the monster began. The climax of my horror came one fateful night when I was cornered by the police. In a deserted warehouse, the two halves of my existence collided. I stood there, surrounded by armed officers, their guns trained on me. For a brief moment, I considered letting go, allowing them to end my torment. But the other self wouldn't allow it. It took over with a ferocious will to survive, turning the situation into a dangerous standoff. As the confrontation escalated, my mind fractured under the strain. Memories, reality, and nightmare melded into a single terrifying tapestry. In that chaos, I saw my life for what it was, a tragic story of a person split in two by trauma, a life hijacked by an unseen predator within. The realization was as harrowing as it was heartbreaking. The standoff ended with me barely escaping, but the chase was far from over. I was now a man on the run, not just from the law but from myself. The truth about my dual existence was out, but it brought no relief, only a deeper plunge into a darkness that had no end. As I fled into the night, the cold air biting at my skin, I felt the last vestiges of my old self slip away. I was no longer Josh, the quiet bookshop worker from Goddard. I was something else entirely, a fractured soul inhabiting a body that committed atrocities beyond comprehension. The realization was a relentless tormentor, gnawing at the edges of my fractured psyche. The days that followed were nightmarish odyssey through a landscape of fear and despair. I moved through the shadows, always one step ahead of the law, but never out of reach of my own inner demons. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford, and when exhaustion overcame me, it was fitful and haunted by vivid nightmares. I avoided populated areas, lurking on the fringes of society. Mirrors became my enemy, for in them, I saw the face of a stranger, a visage marred by guilt and horror. I was a ghost, a specter drifting through a world that I no longer belonged to. During these aimless wanderings, fragments of my past continued to surface, each memory a jagged shard that cut deep into my soul. I remembered the abuse, the helplessness, the creation of my imaginary friend who promised to make everything better. That friend had evolved into something far more sinister, a protector turned predator, a hidden persona that surfaced to shield me from the horrors of reality. In my solitude, I grappled with the duality of my existence. There was a part of me, buried deep, that yearned for redemption, for an end to the cycle of violence. But the other part, the dark entity that had taken control, was driven by a primal urge to survive, to continue its reign of terror. I recalled the faces of my victims, the lives I had extinguished. Their eyes haunted me, accusing, questioning, condemning. The weight of my actions was a crushing burden, one that threatened to drag me into an abyss of madness. As the net of the law tightened around me, I found myself cornered, both physically and mentally. There was no escape, no place to hide where I wouldn't be haunted by the monster I had become. The police were closing in, their pursuit relentless and methodical. But it wasn't the prospect of capture that terrified me the most, it was the realization that I was trapped in a body that was capable of such horrors, a prisoner of my own mind. In my darkest moments, I considered surrender, a final capitulation to the forces that pursued me. But the survival instinct of my alter ego was too strong, propelling me forward in a desperate, aimless flight. The climax of my journey came in an abandoned building, a decrepit structure that stood as a testament to forgotten dreams and broken promises. It was here that I decided to confront my other self, to face the demon that lurked within. As I stood in the decaying remnants of what once was, I felt the presence of my other self, an oppressive force that filled the space with its malevolent intent. With a trembling voice, I addressed the darkness, acknowledging its existence, its purpose, and the pain it had caused. I pleaded for an end to the bloodshed, for a chance to reclaim the shreds of my humanity. But the response was a chilling silence, a void that swallowed my words and left me in despair. In that moment, I realized that there was no separating Josh from the monster. We were one and the same, two sides of a coin, forever bound by the traumas of the past. The revelation was a crushing blow, the final nail in the coffin of my shattered identity. As I emerged from the building, resigned to my fate, I was met by the cold, unyielding gaze of the police. There was no dramatic standoff, no last-minute escape. I simply raised my hands in surrender, the fight drained from my body. The police took me into custody, but it was clear to me that my true prison was my own mind. As I was led away, I looked back at the building, a silent witness to my final confrontation with myself. The unseen predator within had been exposed, but at a cost that was too great to bear. The fall from grace was complete, the journey from innocent bystander to feared killer, culminating in a tragic realization of self. The last chapter of my story was written not in the pages of a book, but in the annals of a small town's history, a cautionary tale of a mind fractured by trauma and a life lost to the shadows. The final chapter of my story unfolds not in the freedom of the world I once knew, but within the cold, unyielding walls of a prison cell. Here, time moves differently, each second a lingering reminder of the life I led and the lives I took. The bustling sounds of Goddard are a distant memory, replaced by the monotonous hum of fluorescent lights, and the distant echoes of other inmates. In the solitude of my cell, I am left to confront the full magnitude of my actions. The faces of my victims haunt me, their silence screams a constant echo in my mind. I am tormented by the pain I have caused, the irreparable damage to families and the fabric of a community I once called home. The police interrogation was a blur, a series of questions that I answered mechanically, numbly. I confessed to the murders, each admission a stab to my own heart. The disbelief and horror in the eyes of the detectives were a mirror to my own soul's torment. They sought a motive, a reason for the senseless violence, but how could I explain the unexplainable? How could I articulate the existence of a darker self, born from the depths of a traumatized mind? My trial was a mere formality, the outcome predetermined. The evidence was overwhelming, and my confession irrefutable. The courtroom was packed with the relatives of the victims, their eyes filled with a mixture of grief, anger, and a desperate search for closure. I could offer them no solace, only the hollow words of an apology that could never undo the harm I had caused. The sentence was delivered with a gravity befitting the severity of my crimes: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the judge pronounced the judgment, a part of me felt relief. The chase was over, the facade had crumbled, and the unseen predator within was caged, if not vanquished. Now, I spend my days in introspection, piecing together the fragments of my fractured psyche. The clarity that eludes me is a source of frustration and despair. I delve into the memories of my childhood, the genesis of my alternate persona, seeking understanding, if not forgiveness. The imaginary friend of my youth, once a source of comfort, had morphed into a sinister entity that commandeered my life. The line between reality and delusion, Josh and the predator, had blurred beyond recognition. In the stillness of my cell, I write. It's a therapeutic exercise, a way to articulate the turmoil that churns within. My words are a testament to the dual nature of my existence, a chronicle of a life derailed by unseen forces. The act of writing is my only solace, a faint glimmer of purpose in the void of my existence. The story I pen is not one of redemption, that ship has long sailed. It's a cautionary tale, warning of the damage a mind can inflict upon itself and others when fractured by trauma. I write so that others might understand, might see the signs before it's too late, might save someone else from the fate that befell me. As I lay down my pen, the echoes of the unseen predator within me still linger. The darkness that once consumed me is now a shadow, a reminder of a past that can never be undone. The hope for forgiveness, for peace, seems as distant as the free world outside my barred window. The story of Josh, the unseen predator of Goddard, concludes not with a dramatic escape or a final act of violence, but with a quiet resignation to a life forever altered by the deeds of a fractured self. The ending is open, not in the sense of a physical escape, but in the endless quest for understanding and atonement within the confines of my mind. Outside, the world moves on, the town of Goddard slowly healing from the wounds I inflicted. But within me, the echoes of the unseen continue to resonate, a haunting reminder of a life that once was and the lives that were lost. The unseen predator is caged, but his shadow lingers, an indelible mark on my soul, and a silent companion in the solitude of my confinement.